You're listening to The Unsafe Bible with Pastor Ken Brown.
And the nations all wind up having different languages as a result of it. It takes place at a place called Babel, which is now known as Babylon. Same place. I find that a demonstration of the Holy Spirit's sense of humor, that where the rebellion took place, God's going to take a man out of that rebellion who's actually a ruler and turn him into a mouthpiece for God, to someone who's going to glorify God. I love that.
King Nebuchadnezzar was a powerful and feared ruler who ruled over the Babylonian Empire. Despite his pride and arrogance, God saw the potential for redemption in him. God humbled Nebuchadnezzar and showed him the error of his ways. Despite his initial resistance, Nebuchadnezzar eventually turned to God and acknowledged his sovereignty. In today's message, Pastor Ken will show you that God's grace and mercy are so vast that even the most unlikely candidates can be transformed. Well, let's join Pastor Ken in the book of Daniel, chapter 4, as he begins his message, Nebuchadnezzar Tweets.
We're in Daniel chapter 4. In Daniel chapter 4, we're going to find out that just like our current resident of the White House loves to use Twitter, if it was in existence in 2500 BC, Nebuchadnezzar would use it. It would be @RealNebuchadnezzar, okay? It have to be. What we're going to see is an actual state document that he wrote, and it's in the Bible. But he wrote it. And what it means when you read this, and this is what I really love about it, God can save anyone. If he can save Nebuchadnezzar, he can save me. I think that's why there's a lot of hope when you read this chapter. So this is really rare when it comes to the Old Testament. It's a first-person commentary on what God has done for me. I mean, you read all throughout the Scriptures where that's what all Jesus says. He just go out and tell people what God's done for you. Tell people what Jesus has done for you. Well, this is Nebuchadnezzar, the king of virtually the whole planet at the time, and he's going to say, this is what God's done for me. Only issue is, he's not a Jew. He's a Gentile. He's the king that conquered Jerusalem, and he's in Babylon, which is the capital of all things evil. In fact, if you look elsewhere in the Bible, it says that Babylon will be destroyed at the end of the age, because it's this comparison. Jerusalem's the house of God. Babylon is the house of evil. But this is the king, and he's going to do something. Again, remember, the first 4 chapters of the book of Daniel are historical. They're telling us and showing us how God's moving among his people, even as they're going into being in exile and being punished for what they did not do. But it also shows us the dealing of Yahweh engineering life and events in an unbeliever to bring him to a faith in Yahweh. I mean, you can see some of what has God had to do to each of us to get us to the point where we go, yep, I want Jesus in my life. It's different. It's a different story for each of us. This is Nebuchadnezzar's story. This is what God had to do in his life to bring him to the point where he said, yes, you are God. It's a picture of all of us. Now, the only difference is I don't know if any of us in the process to come to Christ, we had the situation where we had the Son of God walking around in a fire and we're watching it, okay? I've never had that. I've also never had dreams and have somebody explain it to me. Some of the things that happened in Nebuchadnezzar's life, he experienced the supernatural for real. He knew the supernatural existed because he had seen the demonic side of it with all of the stuff that they do in their temples there in Babylon. And he knew that there was a fallen angels. He knew that. He knew all of that. He knew the spiritual realm existed. It was real to him. But now he's seeing that there's another side to that, and it's been very real in his life, and God just keeps showing up at just different points in his life. So he shows up in his 20s, he shows up again in his 40s, and now he's showing up a little bit later in his life. The unseen realm for him has been clearly in view, not once, but multiple times. And it's a reminder because every time he sits down and nothing's happening, he's looking and talking to a guy by the name of Daniel, who translated his dreams, who is a friend to the three guys who walked out of the fire. So every time he sees Daniel, he's reminded of the fact that God's real. And I'm sure Daniel has not been silent. He's probably been talking about the Lord the entire time. So, and something else we have to remember about Nebuchadnezzar. He, like most world leaders, have a problem. It's called pride. Remember, we talked about it. It's hubris. It's pride for us, but if you're a leader, it's hubris. It's pride. Proverbs 29:23, one's pride will bring him low, but he who is lowly in spirit will obtain honor. And this chapter is going to show us the reality of that in Nebuchadnezzar's life. Now, the thing that's really impressive to me is that this chapter of the book of Daniel has been written by probably, from a historical perspective, the greatest monarch of the times of the Gentiles. Remember, he's the head of gold, okay? And that also means that he doesn't have any underlying laws that he has to obey. He is an absolute despot. Whatever he says is it. But he was the head of gold. And what we see here is that the greatest monarch of the times of the Gentiles winds up at the end of all of it worshiping Yahweh and giving glory to God. It's just amazing what we see that God does and how God moves in this man's life to change it. But here's a sad thing that we're going to see in this whole setup. What was Israel's job? What were they supposed to do as God's people? They were supposed to point the world to Yahweh, right? And that began to happen under Solomon's rule and then kind of fell apart. And it started happening again under Hezekiah's rule, and it fell apart. And at the end of it, they wound up pointing people to the fact that they were doing more sin than the nations they kicked out. What we're going to see here is that where Israel failed, God will use Nebuchadnezzar to do. He will use a Gentile king who conquered the nation of Israel to do what Israel didn't do, and that's to spread the message about Yahweh. He will point the nations to God, not Israel. That's not exactly the way that any good Jewish rabbi is going to want to hear. They're not going to hear that. They're going to want to hear what great things the Jews have done. Well, they didn't do it. The irony is, and I think this is even more of an irony, if you go to Genesis chapter 11, there's a rebellion that takes place. A guy by the name of Nimrod is behind it, and the nations all wind up having different languages as a result of it. It takes place at a place called Babel, which is now known as Babylon. Same place. I find that a demonstration of the Holy Spirit's sense of humor, that where the rebellion took place, God's going to take a man out of that rebellion who's actually a ruler and turn him into a mouthpiece for God, to someone who's going to glorify God. I love that. The fourth chapter, though, is entirely unique. We've already shown that. If you want to look at it, this is an official Babylonian state document. I mean, if we could have the original text, it would probably have a seal of Babylon down at the bottom, and I don't know what their official seal was, but it would probably have a signet ring seal into it. It would be all official and written in cuneiform, of course, which was the standard writing tool, writing language of the day, which to us would look like a bunch of chickens that walked across a piece of tile, but that's what it is. It's the personal testimony of Nebuchadnezzar in his own language. He's going to explain it as to himself. It's the only complete state paper that we have from Babylon. We have sections, and I showed you a picture of one earlier, which is for the Babylonian Chronicles. It's a portion of a history book about the history of Babylon at this time. But this is the whole paper. We have everything in it, and it's here in our Bible. It's the account of this great king, and he is going to, at the end of it, claim to reverence, fear, and worship of Yahweh. So let's take a look at chapter 4, verse 1 to 3. King Nebuchadnezzar, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. This is from the ESV. Peace be multiplied to you. It has seemed good to me to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. In the first 3 verses, you suddenly find yourself comparing, is this the same guy from chapter 2? Is this the same guy from chapter 3 and chapter 1? What's happened for him to say this? It seems good to me to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done and how his kingdom is everlasting. I mean, what happened when Pharaoh was confronted with God? Remember that? He hardened his heart, and there were 10 things happened to basically destroy him and his nation to the point that they were no longer a ruling power. Pharaoh hardened his heart. Nebuchadnezzar didn't. He had a pride problem. Yeah, we all have a pride problem. But he had a serious pride problem. I mean, most rulers, though, do have pride problems. I get a kick out of the fact, talking about pride, there's a story that comes out of England in the 19th century. There was a revival that took place, and a lady by the name of Lady Huntington came to Christ. And everybody wanted to know, how could a noblewoman, someone who's part of royalty, come to Christ? And her answer was, one letter. One letter is the reason why I came to Christ. And they said, what do you mean? Well, in 1 Corinthians 1:26, it says, not many noble are called. There's an M. It doesn't say not any noble are called. And she says, as a result, she came to Christ. And she was busy about the business of telling other people about Jesus. So is it possible for someone in royalty? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've actually heard our president talk about the fact that people's lives have been changed by confronting Jesus Christ and understanding what's going on in their life as a result of meeting him personally. I don't know whether or not he's a believer, but he sure talks about other people who are, and he lifts them up. So we're going to see the same thing with Nebuchadnezzar. We see a picture also, when you take a look at Nebuchadnezzar, you also see kind of a picture of what's going to happen at the end of the age. You see all Gentile power and how it's departed from God. It doesn't want anything to do with God. But at the end of the age, those who are left will come to the Lord. And you see that in Nebuchadnezzar. He comes to the Lord. He comes to his senses. I love that. When we get to that part, he comes to his senses and comes to God. It's just really something. But all the nations at the end of the age, they shall come to God and fall before him and worship him. But most of them aren't right now, as we know. So the king says, and I love this, peace be multiplied, it seems good to me to show the signs and wonders that Yahweh did for him. He's going to, it's not like we haven't seen signs and wonders already, but there's some other things he wants to say. His testimony is extremely personal. This is no longer the God of Daniel, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This is his God, what he's done for him. He testifies to God's signs and God's wonders and God's dominion, and he recognizes that God's rule is above his. And what he's saying is it's good to declare what God has done for him, whereas he is taking in whatever Satan had done for him before, he's not going to talk about that anymore. Do you think Satan has an interest in keeping us silent? Absolutely. He would prefer for us not to talk about what Jesus has done for us. He wants us to be completely silent and let people guess what's been going on in our life as a result of Jesus Christ. He has a huge interest in keeping us silent about the signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for us. And Jesus just says, just tell people what Jesus did for you. And that's what we have to do. We just say, this is what Jesus has done for me. Now, in the Septuagint, it actually starts at chapter 3, verse 98. Remember we talked about that? And then goes to chapter 4, verse 1. And there's a little bit more information, so we'll flip back and forth from that. This is the Septuagint, same section of Scripture. King Nebuchadnezzar to all the peoples, and you start seeing there's a little bit more that he's talking to. Peoples, tribes, and languages who dwell in all the land. May peace be multiplied to you. The signs and wonders that God Most High did with me, it pleases me to announce to you, since they are great and mighty. I like the way that shows up in the Greek translated into the English. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. His authority lasts from generation to generation. Verse 4 of chapter 4. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and prospering in my palace, which kind of tells us that he's at a point where he's no longer going to war. Things are good. Most commentators say he's in his 50s. You saw in the Septuagint it says the 18th year of his dominion. That's not the same as the 18th year of his rule. That's a different term. But here's what he sees. I saw a dream that made me afraid. As I lay in bed, the fancies and the visions of my head alarmed me. So I made a decree that all the wise men of Babylon should be brought before me, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Remember chapter 1? They still can't tell him what he's thinking. Okay? There's no change. Then the magicians, the enchanters, the Chaldeans, the astrologers came in, and I told them the dream. This time he didn't hide it, he told them. But they could not make known to me its interpretation. So he begins his story of how his life was changed forever. This is his testimony. And as believers, we have to have the same thought. As it says in 1 Peter 3:15, in our hearts, honor Christ as Lord, as holy always, but be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that's in you. But do so with gentleness and respect. Just tell them your story. You don't have to be a theologian. You don't have to sit there and have memorized, the Romans road to salvation. All you have to do is just say what Jesus has done for you. People can say all kinds of things, but when you talk about what he has done in your life and how he's changed your life, that's hard for them to refute. This is what Jesus did for me. He changed my life. He brought me from here to here, and only he could have done it. And they're going like, well, yeah, okay. That's hard to refute. They can't refute that. Now, there are a lot of people who want to know, and I'm one of them, Nebuchadnezzar, why didn't you just call Daniel? What's up with that? Well, we don't know. We don't have the whole answer to that question. There have been thousands of pages written, though, of people trying to guess what that is. And I'll answer your question for you. If you want to go and research it and read all the commentaries and the thousands, don't bother. We don't know. Okay? We really don't know. Everything is a guess or a speculation, okay? We really don't know what was going on. Was it this guy's even speculating. He says, well, was it a habit? Was it something? No, don't bother. We don't know. We really don't know. The king is not going out with his troops. He's not fighting anymore. Things are good. Judah's been conquered. Even Egypt may be conquered by this time. And this is in the second half of his reign. The Septuagint, that's also known as the LXX, which is what I wrote there in verse 1, indicates it's the 18th year of his dominion, but not the 18th year of King Nebuchadnezzar. So I don't know if that means he's settled all of it. He's now the emperor, and there was a ceremony, and I don't know. It's just a different term. It's not one that we're used to seeing. So again, and now I'm going to look at the Hebrew Bible. This is the English translation of the Tanakh, which is the Hebrew scriptures. It says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was living serenely in my house. Yeah, things are good. Flourishing in my palace. I had a dream that frightened me, and my thoughts in bed and the vision of my mind alarmed me. I gave an order to bring all the wise men of Babylon before me to let me know the meaning of the dream. The magicians, exorcists, Chaldeans, and diviners came, and I related the dream to them, but they could not make its meaning known to me. And the reason why I wanted to look at the Hebrew scriptures is that I was curious as to whether or not the Tanakh did anything to kind of soften the tone of the fact that the Gentiles coming to know Yahweh and is telling the world about him. I wanted to kind of see, well, what do they think? Maybe they're going to try and change it. We'll see. The Septuagint, though, did not relate that the king was relying on his normal retinue of assorted wise guys. It just says he went straight to Daniel, okay? So let's go back to the Tanakh. This is, again, the Hebrew scriptures. Daniel 4, 5 to 7. Now, finally, Daniel called Belteshazzar after the name of my God. So he's still calling him the name that was given to him, in whom the spirit of the holy gods was, came to me, and I related the dream to him. Belteshazzar, chief magician, in whom I know the spirit of the holy gods to be, and whom no mystery baffles, tell me the meaning of my dream vision that I've seen. In the visions of my mind, in bed, I saw a tree of great height in the midst of the earth. Now, when you come back out of that, you kind of see they're softening it a little bit. They're trying to make it sound like he's still a pagan, which I think is interesting. Verse 8 and 9, though, from the ESV, at last Daniel came in before me, and I like the way that is. He finally comes in. He who is named Belteshazzar, after the name of my God, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And I told him the dream. saying, O Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you. No mystery is too difficult for me. Tell me the visions of my dream that I saw and their interpretation. Now, the Septuagint gives you a little bit more information. It says he got up in the morning and summoned Daniel. It doesn't say he called the wise guys. It just says he summoned Daniel, overseer of the wise men. And then he describes the dream to him. But the way that this is, the way that how abrupt it is, where he introduces it in the Aramaic, he's literally using a device that just says, hey, this dream was unexpected. I wasn't looking forward to this. It just kind of happened. And just like before, now remember, God gave him a dream once before. God was demonstrating his grace to this king. And he's done it one other time too. And he could have come out of the fiery furnace with the three other guys and just taken care of business. He didn't. Yahweh is now showing grace to the king. He's going to reveal a future to him again. But this time it's not the future of the planet. It's Nebuchadnezzar's future. It's going to be very personal. It's a lot closer to home. Verse 10. He's explaining the dream. The visions of my head as I lay in bed were these. I saw, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth. Now, a tree to a Middle Eastern king would be a nation. They convey trees or nations, but there's some things also going on with cosmic trees, and they have mythology about trees, but this here, it's basically a nation, okay? A tree in the midst of the earth, and that gives you the hint right there. Its height was great. The tree grew and became strong, and its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its leaves were beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the heavens lived in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. And he's talking, this is a big empire. This is a big nation. It's got a pretty good economy going on. I saw in the visions of my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. He proclaimed aloud and said thus, chop down the tree and lop off its branches. Strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it and the birds from its branches. But leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze, amid the tender grass of the field. Let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Let his portion be with the beasts of the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from a man's, and let a beast's mind be given to him. And let 7 periods of time pass over him. The sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men, and gives it to whom he will, and sets over it the lowliness of men. This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, saw, and you, O Belteshazzar, tell me the interpretation, because all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known to me the interpretation. But you're able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in you. So, how has God dealt with Nebuchadnezzar up to this point? Round 1, he had a dream about this big statue, and he was the head of gold. And he kind of took that a little too far, and he created an entire statue of gold. So round 2, he built this large statue and made everybody to worship it, except 3 guys who said, nope, not going to do it. And as a result, he saw 4 people walking in the fire, and one of them was the Son of God. And he didn't know how to deal with that.
You've been listening to a message about the inspiring book of Daniel in the Old Testament. Pastor Ken has been diving deep into this book here on the Unsafe Bible. Something that stands out repeatedly is that Daniel went through many trials by fire, showing his faith in the midst of being in exile and an enemy to those who didn't fear God. But every time God came through for him, proving that standing up for your faith brings honor and blessings that can't be attained by the ways of this world. Have you had situations like Daniel's, where you've gotten in trouble for proclaiming Jesus as your Savior? The cost of worldly demise is worth it in staying true to God. It's no easy path to take, but Daniel's example is a stellar one to follow. Do you have any questions about what you heard today? If so, don't hesitate to contact us. You can get in touch with us by going to theunsafebible.com. Once there, go to the Connect tab and click on Connect Card. There, you can fill out a form for us to get in touch with you. To listen to this message or any others from this series in Daniel, just look under the Media tab at theunsafebible.com. You'll also find additional teachings in other books of the Bible. If you found this ministry to be a blessing as you've been listening, you have the opportunity to help invest in the Unsafe Bible ministry by checking out the Give tab. We're grateful for any donation given to help further the message of the gospel. That website again is theunsafebible.com. Join us again for another edition of the Unsafe Bible.